Hey everyone, I finally found the time to post another update to what's been going on. For those of you that might not remember, I left off my other post with my mom calling me, telling me to come to her house. Jeff followed me to my parents' house that night to keep an eye out. We drove separately, as I didn't want to have to explain anything to them about why I had a random guy with me. Jeff was concerned that the men who were harassing me possibly did something to my parents in order to lure me outside of my hotel room, but that didn't appear to be the case at first. I already knew something was seriously wrong just based on how my mom was acting and what time she had originally called me at. I was expecting the worst when I turned onto my parents' street, but once I actually made it to their house, everything looked to be totally fine. Nothing looked out of place. My mom's car was in the driveway, and there didn't even look to be any lights on inside. I quickly parked my car and ran up to the front door anyway. It was locked, so I began to knock. I didn't hear any movement coming from inside. I looked down the street where I saw Jeff parked. I made eye contact with him and just shrugged my shoulders, showing him I was just as confused as he was. After knocking again and still getting no answer, I tried looking for my phone. I realized I had left it in my car and hurried back to it. Once I found my phone, I realized I had a missed call from my mom. I must have not heard it vibrate as I drove frantically to my parents. My mom had also left me a voicemail. She told me something had happened to my dad and that she was riding with him in the ambulance to the hospital. She asked me to meet her there. I jogged over to Jeff's car to update him on what was happening, and he told me to lead the way and that he would follow me to the hospital. The drive over was relatively short, but felt much longer due to not knowing what was going on with my dad, or if he was even going to be okay. Once I made it to the hospital, I found somewhere to park and headed inside to the emergency room. After giving the front desk the name of my dad and telling them who I was eventually led back to his room. Unfortunately, I wasn't allowed into the room as doctors were still working on him, but I was able to finally meet up with my mom and talk to her about what was going on. She was still crying, but was a little bit more composed, at least enough to be able to talk to me. I could tell she was slightly relieved that I was there, which I'm sure helped as well. I was finally able to find out what was going on, but even my mom didn't have all the information yet. But she told me what she knew so far. Earlier that evening, after she had finished showering, she went downstairs. At first, she thought my dad had fallen asleep in his chair while watching TV. She tried waking him up to tell him to go to bed, but she wasn't able to. That's when she realized something was wrong. She tried checking for a pulse and found that it was very weak and he was barely breathing. She immediately called 911. By the time EMS arrived, my dad was in cardiac arrest. He was taken to the hospital where doctors began working on him, and here we are. That's everything she knew at that point, and there was nothing else left for us to do but wait. Nearly an hour passed before we found anything else out. The doctors came to speak with my mom and I. They weren't sure yet what caused it, but for one reason or another, my dad's heart had stopped. Based on his age and the fact that he wasn't in great shape, the doctor said it wasn't necessarily caused by an underlying medical condition or anything else in particular. They ended up having to put him on a ventilator, and he was basically only being kept alive by machines. Obviously, my mom and I were as upset as you could imagine. We were told that the doctors would monitor him overnight, and we didn't need to make any decisions just yet, but it didn't look good. My mom decided to spend the night in the hospital, and was going to sleep in the recliner in my dad's room. I told her I was going home, but asked her to call me if anything happened. Otherwise, I told her I would talk to her first thing in the morning. Jeff was still waiting for me when I left, and he followed me back to our room. I had a very difficult time sleeping that night. In addition to what was already going on, I had this other awful situation that kept me up. I was in and out of bed for hours that night, until I finally drifted off to sleep. It seemed as if I had only slept for minutes before I was being awoken by my phone ringing. My heart sank when I realized that once again it was my mom. It was 4 a.m., and I knew she wouldn't be calling me at that time to wake me up if she only had good news to report. My mom's sobs on the other end of the line confirmed my fears. Despite being hooked up to machines, my dad's condition worsened, and he was pronounced dead shortly after 3:30 that morning. Despite the doctors originally guessing my dad had a heart attack, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to it. I ended up going back to the hospital to meet up with my mom again. The first thing I remember seeing were police officers. I didn't know why they were there, and once I saw my mom, I made a beeline towards her. I tried asking her questions, but all we could do was hold each other and cry. The next couple days were a blur. I decided to stay with my mom those next couple nights and gave Jeff the night off. 2 nights went by, and my mother and I were woken up by a loud knock on the door. We soon realized it was the police, and they were there to execute a search warrant. Obviously, my mom and I knew neither of us did anything wrong, so we complied to the fullest. We were escorted outside while the officers went through our belongings inside. It was determined that the overnight bag I brought over had nothing of concern, and I was told I could go. The detective told me he'd call me if he had any further questions. On the way home, I called Jeff and asked him if he'd meet me at our hotel room. The next couple days were pretty uneventful. I stayed in contact with my mom as she and I tried planning my dad's funeral, even though we were still waiting for his autopsy to be completed. The police had removed several things from my mom's house, but we weren't sure why. But since we both knew that neither of us did anything, we weren't concerned. But it was still very confusing, and we wanted answers. One evening, I got off the phone with my mom, and we planned on talking at some point the next day. I woke up from my phone ringing the following morning. I received a message asking if I would accept charges from the local jail in our area. It was my mom who was calling me from jail. Of course, without hesitation, I hit accept to find out why my mom was in jail. She has no criminal background and couldn't hurt a fly. Once I got her to calm down, I got her to tell me what was going on. Despite my parents never using cyanide and having none in the house, CSI found it and other traces spread throughout many drinks at my parents' house, under the sink, etc. It was all over. And of course my mom's fingerprints were found all over the containers the cyanide was found in. At this point, I probably don't need to tell you what actually killed my dad, but his cause of death was determined to be from cyanide poisoning. I did everything in my power to protect myself, but even more importantly, protect my loved ones. Whoever was after me was going after those I cared about first. Once they take out everyone I care about, only then would they kill me. Or even worse, they'd leave me alive to live out the rest of my days feeling responsible for the death of my family. It was time to stop running and time to stop hiding. I knew now I needed to change tactics. I told my mom we'd cover her legal expenses and get her the best lawyer available, and then I got off the phone with her. I didn't lie to my mom. I really would get her the best legal defense I could find. But when it came to these men hunting my family and I'm done hiding. It's time for me to take the fight to them.